Hi, everyone. Hoping that you are doing well. We're going to be looking at the book of Revelation. Yes, the book of Revelation. We're going to be looking at chapter 7. And what we're going to be doing is addressing the absence of two groups in this listing. And those two groups are Dan and Ephraim. And so you might have noted that in this listing of these children of Jacob, that these two entities are missing from the list. So we're going to go over that list, and then we're going to talk a little bit about who Ephraim and Dan were and who they might possibly be in current times. Now, there are some questions about the book of Revelation. There's so much stuff going on in there, and it is sort of out of place in terms of the narrative. And so it's very conspicuous sitting at the end of the New Testament. And there are some questions about whether the book of Revelation, there's so much in there, whether it is complete prophetic vision or whether some of it is a plan to be enacted. And so there are a few things going on there, but we're just going to focus right now on Revelation 7 and this absence of Dan and Ephraim. Okay, so let's just jump into this. We're at Revelation 7. This is coming from John. It's unclear completely which John this happens to be. However, this is from an entity identified as John on the island of Patmos. And so we're in Revelation 7, and we're at Revelation 7:1, and the topic is 144,000 sealed. And it states, "After this, I saw four angels standing at the four corners of the earth, holding back its four winds, so that no wind would blow on land or sea or on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east with the seal of the living God. And he called out in a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea, 'Do not harm,'" this is in quotes, "'do not harm the land or sea or trees until we have sealed the foreheads of the servants of our God.'" Then it goes on to list this 144,000 here. And it says, "And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel." Now, what's noteworthy here is that this listing is not all of the tribes of Israel as indicated in the Old Testament. And so what you have here is this listing, and it says from the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed, from the tribe of Reuben, 12,000, from the tribe of Gad, 12,000, from the tribe of Asher, 12,000, from the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 from the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000 from the tribe of Simeon, 12,000 from the tribe of Levi, 12,000 from the tribe of Issachar, 12,000 from the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000 from the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. That's interesting in and of itself, because usually the tribe of Joseph is divided up between Manasseh and Ephraim. However, in this instance, you have a tribe of Joseph. So you have 12,000 for Joseph, and from the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000. Who's missing? The tribe of Dan is missing, and the typical tribe of Ephraim is missing. And so you see this replacement of Joseph instead of Ephraim, and then Dan is simply not mentioned. Now, there's also this 12 tribes chart. And interestingly, on this chart, and I've seen a few of these charts, on this chart, Dan is also missing. And so where you have this listing of these 12 tribes being identified, Dan is not included in this listing. And so consistent with this particular chapter of Revelation, it's unclear as to why the 12 tribe chart does not have Dan listed, but as with this, Dan is basically missing. So we're going to look at Dan and Ephraim, again, who they were and who they potentially are. We've talked, of course, about Dan before. We've talked about Dan extensively. Um, and you can, of course, identify Dan by people holding on to this name Dan. At least that's the narrative. So let's go on from here. And then we're going to entertain some possibilities about why these two entities are missing and also why people are not really addressing this. This is a major glaring discrepancy, and so it should be reconciled. And so when we look in Strong's Concordance, you see Dan meaning judge, phonetically spelled dawn. And so this entity is understood as a son of Jacob, also the territory that goes along with that. You also see indications of Dan or Don in what's known as Israel right now. And here you see the descendants of Dan are also known as the Danites or the Dani or the Dani. In terms of etymology, this leads you to 1777, and that is din or dean, which means to judge. You might recall that painting of Dinah, and also recall that Dinah, rooted in the same thing as Dan, also relates to this construct of judge or judging or judgment. And you can see there are variations here with respect to this name Dan and its relationship to judging, judgment, punishment. You also see that it means governor. It's related to recompense, obedience, ruling, and governing. And so you see Dan here, this name is associated with many things related to the law. So you see also Dan meaning act as judge, to minister judgment of God, to plead the cause, and so in that way to act as an advocate also. And you also see down below to plead a cause, to execute judgment, to vindicate in battle against enemies. Again, this sort of warrior dynamic with respect to Dan being mighty and being a judge. And so we've got a lot going on here with respect to Dan, Don, Dean, Din. And then you see down at the bottom a reference to executing judgment with respect to Egypt also. And then you have an entry that seems out of place on the surface, but then when you consider some of the narrative of Dan, it starts to make sense. And so you see that it's related to this idea of sail direct or a straight course related to sailing. And Dan was known to be related to ships. And so this makes sense when you consider that. And so now we're going to look at not only who Dan was, but who Dan potentially might be. And so we've already talked about Dan being associated with a number of people groups on the west coast of Africa, including very specifically Dahomey. And so Dan is associated with being an adder, a serpent. He is also understood, as we talked about, as a judge. So his name means judge. But Dan is also associated with coastal areas. And so Dan is understood as being situated by the waters. So Dan is a coastal group. Dan is a seafaring group. And Dan is known to occupy the Isles. And so there are other groups that occupy the Isles, but these are things that are related to Dan, this idea of being coastal. And so you also see there's this narrative about the people of Dan maintaining the name of Dan in the geographic spaces. And so you see evidence of this, of course, with Dahomey, because it's also known as Dahomey, and they have an entire narrative historically about this name. You also see the name associated with the Danes and also Danann. You also see Dan associated with the Isles, the British Isles. And so you have Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, the Isle of Man. Dan is also associated with the land space now known as Israel in the east. Also, you see evidence of Dan in Virginia, and you see evidence of Dan in India. And so you see these sprinklings related to Dan all over the place. But one of the people groups that people sometimes don't think about is the people group that is in the Americas and primarily in North America. So you have those descendants of Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, and the Isle of Man. What's interesting is that in North America and in the Isles, you have a number of people identifying based upon other sons of Jacob in North America, namely Judah. And in some other places, like you think about Jamaica, there's an acquaintance with Benjamin. But when you consider that Dan is typically associated with, in terms of etymology, in terms of name, history, tends to be associated with these isles, the British Isles and other isles. And so you have those people groups in those isles and the descendants of those people groups, which again includes Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, Isle of Man. Now, even though you have so many people groups in the Americas descending from the people groups that we just talked about, you don't really have a lot of conversation going on or a lot of exegesis or eisegesis even about the Dan identity and the implications of being associated with Dan. And it almost seems like people just sort of distance themselves from that potential identity of Dan and take on all of these other people group names, particularly other sons of Jacob. But you have quite a bit of evidence suggesting that there is a presence, a heavy presence of Dan in West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. And of course, you have India and Israel. Okay, so moving right along, you have also this son of Joseph named Ephraim, and he's also not listed. And again, the birthright, the blessing is usually split between Ephraim and Manasseh, and then Joseph is not included. He's not included as one of the tribes with land. All of it was given to his children. It's not completely clear why that took place. There are all sorts of assertions, but it's not completely clear. Another oddity about this Ephraim Manasseh situation is that Ephraim received the birthright blessing that should have been going to the firstborn Manasseh, and this Jacob did this. And so there is some pattern going on with the firstborn not receiving the birthright that the firstborn should be receiving. So there's some pattern going on here. Again, it's unclear why, but this is an ongoing thing. One way or another, the firstborn does not receive the birthright blessing, and the secondborn somehow usurps the birthright. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Jacob and Esau, or whether you're talking about Isaac and Ishmael. Now you have it with Ephraim and Manasseh. And so in this instance, you have the younger one receiving this double portion versus the firstborn. However, even after Ephraim receives this double portion versus the firstborn, EPHRAIM is not included in this list of entities that are sealed in this book of Revelation. So when you hear about the 144,000, that particular listing does not include EPHRAIM, and it does not include Dan. Now we're going to jump into this history of EPHRAIM and this identity of EPHRAIM. We've talked about EPHRAIM before, but we're going to revisit some of this in this particular context. And so EPHRAIM has a presence in a number of places in terms of the etymology, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of people carrying this name. And so we've seen that EPHRAIM, in terms of the root, has a presence in both Africa and also Western Europe. And so you see here that EPHRAIM is a son of Joseph, and it also includes his descendants and their territories. There's an interesting numbering dynamic with respect to Strong's, and we've talked about this before with respect to EPHRAIM. There's some sort of conflation also between EPHRAIM and Lot, and so there are some dynamics that conflate those two identities. And so what you see here is that EPHRAIM, in terms of etymology, traces right back to that root, a fair, and we've talked about a fair before. We've looked at some of the historical documentation related to a fair, and then we've looked at some of the scripture indications related to a fair. And as you recall, a fair is related in terms of the etymology to not only the Isles, the British Isles, but also Africa in and of itself. And so the word Africa is rooted in a fair. And so in many ways, it looks like Africa is a territory that belongs to EPHRAIM. A fair, Africa, Afrique, coming out of Scotland, Ireland area, EPHRAIM. So you see this name, you see this root being very much present in Western Europe and very much present in West Africa. Now, there are some indications that some people may have been erroneously identified as descended from Ham with respect to this root, a fair. But again, you see a heavy presence of a fair, Africa, Afrique, West Africa, and Western Europe. And here you have some information about EPHRAIM, about the territory of EPHRAIM, and EPHRAIM is identified as the second son of Joseph. It's also noteworthy that Joseph's two children came about as a result of him being sold into slavery and then being in Egypt. And so his children are not what would be considered descendants of Jacob. His children are Egyptian. And again, here you see the name of EPHRAIM, and also his descendants are known as the Ephraimites or the Ephraimi. And again, addressing the etymology of EPHRAIM. EPHRAIM is rooted in a fair, and you see it at Strong 666 with a fair meaning a covering or a bandage. This is related to something that is hidden, something that is not conspicuous. So something that is out of sight, something that is covered. And remember, this is also related to Lot. And so again, you see this root meaning a covering or a bandage. And you also see the Assyrian rendering, meaning covering a garment. Now we've looked at this construct of a fair and e fair a number of times with respect to a number of people groups, including again Lot and also the Scots, the Irish, And so we see here again that a fair is related to this construct of ashes. And so the construct of covering, a turban, and ashes. And looking at Strong 665, we see a fair, and in this instance, again, it is ashes, also one indication of dust. And here you see additional indications related to a fair, meaning ashes as light, flying, ashes of a red heifer used in purification, on the head as a sign of humiliation. You also see it related to scattereth hoarfrost, also related to filthy and loathsome, also related to mourning, grief, and worthless. You also see it again as this idea of something being enclosed, covered, enveloped, also in relation to a turban. And here we see ashes again, also meaning to bestrew. Now, as with Dan, there are multiple assertions about the name Ephraim and the people groups that are associated with this name Ephraim. And so there are some assertions that Ephraim is associated with Nigeria, Portugal, Spain, Morocco, and Puerto Rico. Now, the only reason Puerto Rico is listed here is because in that 12 tribe chart, Puerto Rico has been identified or given the name, the people there. They've been given the tribal affiliation of Ephraim. Again, it's unclear how people are coming up with these identifications, but that is the identity that is given to Puerto Rico. So what you have here is, and we're going to look at this, is Nigeria related to Ephraim, Portugal related to Ephraim, Spain, and Morocco. So individuals coming out of those contexts being identified with Ephraim. And so being identified with a fair, being identified with a fair or e fair. And so you can see that even when you're looking at this name Ephraim. And all of these people groups sort of hang together in terms of history, in terms of geography, in terms of migration. Now, the assertion about Ephraim on the west coast of Africa is that the people who are identified as Ephraim live among the Yoruba. And so the narrative is that they came from Morocco after they were banished from the Iberian Peninsula after 1492. And it's noteworthy that they speak a Creole, so to speak here, of Moroccan Arabic, Yoruba, and Aramaic. And so in terms of language, this is noteworthy. And so this group is being identified as the Iberian Jews of Yoruba nationality. And so coming out of the Iberian area, coming through Morocco into the west coast of Africa in response to the Inquisition. Now, this is important to keep in mind because there are also all sorts of questions about the identities of the entities that are coming out of Europe that are identifying as descendants of Jacob. Questions about whether the entities are identifying as biological descendants of Jacob or as proselytes. And so that question comes up when you're talking about those coming out of Iberia. And so you also see this connection between Nigeria and Portugal. So there's a heavy Portuguese influence on the west coast of Africa. Also, what's noteworthy is that when you try to search for this children of Ephraim group, another people group pops up. And so it's not this people group that pops up. And there's also a spelling that they are using for children of Ephraim, which is not considered the typical spelling that you would find in the Old Testament. And so they are using BNAI versus, just BEN, or you sometimes see BENE or BENI. And so this is somewhat different here. And so the assertion continues on to identify this particular people group as Ephraimite Moors. And so they are understood as coming from the house of Joseph, the tribe of Ephraim. And there's a narrative about their movement throughout that west coast of Africa and the western part of Europe, and also the northern part of Europe, and then in some instances the southern part of Africa. And so you here see now there is this identification with the Afar or the Affair people, and you also see a correlation between Ephraim and the tribe of Dan in this particular narrative. And as you recall, when we looked at the word Africa and the history of the word Africa, we saw all of these variations in terms of roots. And you see this again here. And what's asserted here is that the land of the Ephraimites was known as the land of EPHRAIM. And so this goes right back to Scotland and the use of this root for many females of Scots descent. And so again, you see these variants in terms of this Ephraim or Affair in Africa and in other parts of the world. Now, given these assertions about Ephraim and the relationship between this name Ephraim and Africa and Scotland, you would perhaps anticipate that when looking for the people groups, that you would see these various people groups: Africa, Western Europe, Northern Africa, Western Africa. But what comes up is India, and it's repeated. When you look at Bene Ephraim, what comes up is India. And there is quite a large contingent of individuals identifying as the children of Ephraim in India. And so those who have this name of Ephraim and Bene, they appear to be situated in India. And those who are using that traditional spelling, not the BNAI, but the BENE or the BENI, they are in India. And so these are some depictions here. We'll look at a few more. And here you see some additional depictions, again, coming out of India. And it is noted that the Indians that are depicted are darker Indians. And so you have this elephant in the room. What is noted here is that in that book of Revelation, in the 7th chapter, you have two groups of people missing. And these two people groups are known as Dan and Ephraim. What's noteworthy is that in terms of the Americas, in terms of Western Europe, in terms of Western Africa, in terms of India, in terms of the place known as Israel now, you have a number of these people who would be identified as Dan or Ephraim in these particular spaces. But what you don't have is a conversation going on about why these people groups are missing from that book, Revelation, in terms of that chapter 7. There's not a lot of conversation going on about this, particularly when you look at the people groups on the west coast of Africa. We're talking about large people groups here. And you're talking about the overwhelming majority of earlier people in the Americas. And you're talking about a large contingent of people who apparently identify as Judah in the United States. So there is this narrative that those who are descendants of Jacob, who are in the United States, that those entities are Judah. You also have an assertion that Judah is in the location known as Israel. You also have these other narratives about the people groups in various isles having various names, but when you trace it back, you see this heavy Scots, Irish, British Isles ancestry. And so when looking at those clusters of people, you have what looks like a heavy presence of both Ephraim and Dan. And so it's unclear what the implications are. It's unclear why the names are not listed in that list in Revelation 7. But it definitely looks like something that people would be exploring, trying to deconstruct, trying to get a better understanding of. But what it looks like is happening is that instead, people are more focused on identifying with people groups that are definitely listed in that book of Revelation, particularly when you're talking about those who are in the Americas. So we're going to leave with a scripture, Ecclesiastes 7:8, and it indicates the end of a thing is better than its beginning. So the question is, what does that mean? Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.